Hi everyone, we're just going to get started in a minute. I know a lot of people tend to call in right as the webinar is starting. So we'll just give it about 30 seconds or so. All right, we're going to get started. So thank you to everyone who is attending our webinar today on incorporating food scraps drop-off programs into your yard waste composting facility. This webinar is sponsored by We Care Denali, Milton Cat, and Casella Organics. So first, I just want to start off by saying Happy New York State Compost Awareness Week. This is an international awareness week for composting, and praising all of its good benefits and trying to get the word out to the public and everyone involved in composting how much we appreciate it and all the opportunities there are. For New York State, you can follow along on Facebook and Instagram at New York State Save Our Food. You can also find more information on New York State Compost Awareness Week on the NYSAR3 website, which is NYSAR3, and Google New York State Compost Awareness Week. So for those of you who don't know, this webinar is officially being hosted by NYSAR, which is New York State Association for Reduction, Reuse, and Recycling. They're a professional organization within the state for materials management professionals, and they focus on recycling, composting, product stewardship, and extended producer responsibility. As you can see, there's a number of benefits included into being a member. And this slideshow will be shared with everyone who's attending, and we'll also be recording the webinar. So I've included some links in here for you to find some more information. Within NYSAR, there is the New York State Organics Council, which is a subset of materials management professionals that specifically focus on organics. Right now, there's about 60 of us. We have monthly conference calls, active working groups, and it's really just a space for organics professionals to come together, discuss some of the projects they're working on, any news that's going on, regulation updates, etc. And if you're interested in joining the Organics Council, you can contact Jesse Kearns. His email is listed on the screen. To join the Organics Council, you do not have to be a NYSAR member, although membership to NYSAR is always encouraged. So whether you're here because you had intended on joining the 2020 New York State Organic Summit or because you heard of the webinar a different way, we really appreciate you being here today. For those who don't know, the 2020 New York State Organic Summit was scheduled for April 7th to 8th in Albany, New York, but was canceled because of COVID concerns. So we transitioned to hosting a virtual summit. And so we'll be hosting 3 different webinars. We had our first one on May 4th, which involved bringing food scraps drop-off programs to your community. We did record this, and we will be making the recording available on the NYSAR website. Today, we're having the webinar on incorporating food scraps into yard waste composting facilities, and on May 19th, we'll be having a webinar on managing wasted food, lessons learned nationally, and New York State's plan of action. The May 19th webinar will feature Nora Goldstein from Biocycle, who will talk through some of the national trends she's observed in organics recycling and where New York State fits in the bigger picture of things. And then it'll be followed up by Sally Rowland with New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, who will give an update on the New York State food donation and food scraps recycling law. We've also created an activity to expand your networks and increase opportunities for collaborations. This is a survey where you're going to share your contact information and then also share if you're looking for maybe a partner in a project, some sort of resource you're looking for, research. Then you can also, there's a second question that follows that asks you to share anything that maybe that you could provide to others. For example, if you're a consultant firm, you could say, hey, I know how to design a composting facility, and here's where you can go to find more information on that. So it's really just a survey to help people connect each other, try to recreate some of those feelings of that face-to-face interaction. And I'll also mention after today's webinar, we'll be having a compost chat for 30 minutes on Zoom, and that's once again to help create some of that face-to-face interaction. Our speakers will be there, and it's just more time to ask more detailed questions or to share a project you're working on with others. So we have saved the date for the next New York State Organic Summit. It will be April 6th to 7th of next year at the Albany Capitol Center in Albany, New York. And while we will answer any COVID related questions today, the webinar series is really more to plan for the future. The United States Composting Council did a really great webinar series, Composting in the Time of COVID-19. As you can see, they held a number of different webinars. I would definitely recommend checking them out. They were very informative. And once again, we'll definitely answer any COVID related questions today, but the webinars really are focused more on planning ahead. And so without further ado, we'll jump into our webinar, Incorporating Food Scraps into Yard Waste Composting Facility. And our speakers today will be Corey Mansell from Center for Ecotechnology, Nora Goldstein from BioCycle, and James McSweeney. And this webinar was made possible by our sponsors, We Care Denali, Milton Cat, and Casella Organics. And before we get started, we're going to hear from one of our silver sponsors, We Care Denali, of Emma Yates.
Everyone.
Emma, I've unmuted you, so go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Emma Yates with We Care Denali. First off, I just want to thank the New York State DEC and NYSR for putting this on still and allowing us all to come together, plan, and learn more about the organics in our state. As an essential business, we are still fully operational at all of our facilities, of course, placing an emphasis of safety on our employees and our customers. We operate 15 composting facilities throughout the country, and we have 3 in New York State. And we also include other services like anaerobic digestion, beneficial use, compost facility design, build, operate packages, compost product marketing plans, and marketing and branding services. And if you guys have any questions relating to any of the services that we do offer, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Again, thank you, and I hope everyone enjoys the webinar.
Thanks, Emma. And if you could just chat me an email that people could get in contact with you, or a general email that people can touch with you, I can put in the chat for everyone to see.
Okay, great. I'll send that over.
All right, so we will move into I'm going to turn it over to Corey from Center for Ecotechnology. She is your Strategic Services Representative, and she's going to help set the scene for everything that's going to be talked about today.
Am I there?
Yep, there we go. I just unmuted you. Yep.
Okay, great. So this is Corey Mansell, Strategic Services Representative at the Center for Ecotechnology speaking. Thank you first and foremost to New York DEC and NYSR for inviting us to speak on today's webinar. I'm really excited that we're still able to talk about this toolkit, even if we had to transition to a webinar platform. So today, Nora Goldstein from the esteemed BioCycle magazine and I will discuss the toolkit we developed in partnership, Community Toolkit Adding Food Waste to a Yard Trimmings Facility. So this is designed to help decision makers evaluate if food waste is appropriate for their existing leaf and yard compost site, and if so, really how to move in that direction. And we realize that as the attention to wasted food grows, there's also an increasing need for developing and supporting infrastructure across the EPA food recovery hierarchy. So of course, we can think about building new processing facilities, that being composting or anaerobic digestion, and also supporting food rescue organizations or food banks. But really, this toolkit assesses the opportunity we have, potentially have at our existing sites, and looking at some of the initial questions. So then after our presentation, we'll also have James McSweeney, who is the owner of Compost Technical Assistance, and he will walk us through the best practices for composting, diving a bit deeper into the pile, if you will, with recipe development and some case studies. As Christine mentioned, we'll take some questions in between the presentations and at the end, but we're all happy to stay on for the compost chat to dive even further into the discussion. There we go. So first, the Center for Ecotechnology, or CET, is a nonprofit, and we help people and businesses save energy and reduce waste. So we're able to help businesses and institutions implement programs on the ground, but also are able to contribute and apply the effective public policy that is focused on these efforts. Before we walk through the toolkit itself, I'll turn it over to Nora.
Hello, everybody, and thank you as well to DEC and NYSAR for transitioning to virtual. Looking forward to talking to you all every day. Today, I'm editor of BioCycle, and for 60 years we were a print magazine, and starting in January of 2020, we transitioned to a digital e-newsletter and soon to be unveiling a brand new exciting website. So if you're not signed up for BioCycle Connect, please do so, because we'd love to have you reading it. It's free and just gets delivered to you every Wednesday. Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we've created this toolkit in response to some of the inquiries that CET and BioCycle were receiving in the past couple of years around the growing attention towards wasted food diversion or processing. So as zero waste plans and organic recycling laws began to take effect, we also saw a corresponding increase in inquiries from facilities wondering if their current leaf and yard composting sites were suitable for food scraps, and can they add this material into their piles, which is a great question. But there are some key questions and factors to deciding if these sites are ready or at least can be ready for the additional material. We were, of course, excited to partner with BioCycle to develop this because I have heard that they know a thing or two about compost. And I also wanted to thank USDA, who did support the development of this toolkit. So it's a really great opportunity. And some of these initial questions when considering adding food scraps is, why would I want to add food scraps first and foremost? And then what type of food, what equipment will I need? What are the options for finished compost? So BioCycle and CET work together to help streamline the existing resources that support and answer these questions, developed a decision-making tree, a practice site evaluation, and then also outlined some composting ground rules. And so we'll walk through some of these components today, and then again followed by James' presentation, who will look at some of the recipe best practices as well. So why should we compost food waste? Well, number one, you may be responding to New York's food scrap recycling law or your own local regional goals. So this may be more of a regulatory driver, but nonetheless, there are societal and economic benefits to incorporating food scraps. So for instance, a couple years ago, New York actually studied the cost-benefit analysis of the state's proposed organic recycling law, which is now passed with modifications. And I won't go into the details here, but it did highlight the millions in net benefits from factors such as compost market revenue and the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And likewise, BioCycle studied collection programs across the country, and then saw that many of these programs were successful because they helped meet these diversion goals, kind of referring back to the potential regulatory or local driver, but also helped save money with the avoided disposal costs and reduced trash frequency. And lastly, but still just as important, there might also be just an increasing demand from your businesses and residents to have an outlet for their food scraps. And so this is a great way to respond to their their requests to do so, and kind of supporting that community engagement aspect.
Great, thank you, Corey. So as Corey mentioned, the very first thing, or one of the first things you'll see in the guide, is a decision-making tree, which is a series of yes/no questions. For example, if you have a yard trimmings composting facility, and the answer is yes, you can immediately go to section 2, which is the physical site assessment. If the answer is no, the next question is, well, can you use another public agency's facility, and so forth. And if you answer no each time, eventually you'll default to the other options. For example, home composting incentives, community composting infrastructure, and so on. So the physical site assessment, the initial assessment, is really based on these kinds of questions you see here, but each one is answered with rules of thumb to just give the flavor for why one, it's better or worse, or what you minimally need for a composting site, a yard trimmings composting site, to accommodate food waste. And after going through a number of pages of the physical site assessment, we put in this little practice site assessment worksheet. And for example, it also goes in, this particular worksheet has a minimum of what we recommend you need to compost food waste, and a better. And so, for example, and the question number 3, do you have a dedicated food waste receiving area? And the minimum is you have the capability to create a space as needed when loads of food waste arrive, and better is to have a dedicated food waste receiving area. So that there are variations, but you will, these are the basic fundamentals that you'll look at. Sorry, Corey, next one. So James will get into this a lot more, but we do walk through the best practices to compost food waste, and it addresses the rules of thumb related to site design, operational considerations. I'm not going to go in read the list down, but I will say on available carbon, if you're have a yard trimmings composting facility, by default you have carbon there to mix with food scraps. The question is, for example, is that carbon that you have enough is it just leaves, or is it also brush, so that you're adding some structure to the pile when you mix in the food scrap. So you'll see there's sections throughout the guide that address these various issues. And this is, to me, one of the most important things, if you don't read anything else in the guide, which we certainly hope you will, are these food waste composting ground rules. And these apply no matter whether you're a seasonally operated yard waste composting site or a full-scale year-round facility. There's these fundamentals, starting with you can never let a fresh load of food waste sit on the pad once it's unloaded. And there's these other elements, but this is just really important. And the main reason is that food waste does not degrade gracefully. And so you're instantly dealing with liquids, and in some cases, some odors and possible vectors. So those are the reasons to follow these ground rules. And Corey, back to you.
Great. So now that you've looked at your operations itself, kind of reflecting on these ground rules, now you can also kind of look at what types of food waste are you able to accept and process. Because the type of feedstock that you begin to accept will impact some of the facility design, the needed infrastructure, and even in some cases the permitting category. Of course, as you can see here too, the types of food waste you accept will also impact the potential contamination that you have. I mean, regardless of the types, you do want to be considering contamination, but some are more likely than others. So the two larger categories are pre and post consumer waste. So pre-consumer waste applies to kitchen prep as well as the prepared and packaged foods that do not make it to the consumer. Of course, the packaged food, if it's not in compostable ware, will need to be depackaged before processing, but nonetheless pre-consumer. While post-consumer is more of the food waste that is either sold or served, for instance, plate scrapings at the end of your meal. Then within that, there are some subcategories that we touched upon in the document, and two I'll reflect here. Here is the pre-consumer vegetative. So that's primarily fruit and veggie trimmings, brewery waste, coffee grounds, probably most likely some clean material, but it is going to be material that's high in liquid content. So you might want to consider managing the loads with soiled paper or corrugated cardboard to help mitigate some of the excess moisture that comes off of this product. Second, there's also front of house collections. So most likely, this also contains items such as meats, dairies, and potentially compostable products. And so kind of what I mentioned earlier, these front of house programs might have the higher possibility for contamination, potentially just due to the confusing nature of non-compostable versus compostable ware. So we'll talk about it later, but you definitely want to be managing this contamination and what you are able to accept or not accept with education at the forefront with your residents and businesses, which can be at the forefront with mailers or ongoing with potentially phone surveys, kind of helping re-educate as much as possible. And then also having a process to manage the potential contamination at the site itself. And so towns have sometimes seen success when they are able to put lid stickers on their containers that include photos or have signage that are in multiple languages. It really depends on your town, but you do want to be thinking about, of course, the recipe development, but then also how you're going to kind of manage the educational component to accepting the different types of food waste. And last but not least, some towns may also have the opportunity to evaluate if they can accept food waste commingled with their leaf and yard trimmings pickup. So BioCycle, the study that I reflected on earlier around US collection programs, showed that 71% of the curbside collection programs and 45% of the drop-off programs included this commingled product of leaf and yard trimmings with food scraps. That said, of course, some of them are not necessarily going to municipally operated composting facilities, but it's still a consideration. Some other discussion points are, how will you collect and haul this material? Will you collect and haul this material? So are you interested in offering the pickup service? But that said, do you have an agreement with an existing or contract with an existing solid waste hauler that could provide this service, or could you outsource it? Or if your jurisdiction offers this service, what are your trucking needs and availabilities? So for instance, some municipalities began collecting organics and recyclables in split trucks, but that's not always feasible for every town. Other entities converted to every other week trash collection, either pairing it or switching it from trash and organics, which could potentially help save money. Although there are also other creative ways to address the hauling needs if that's of interest. So for instance, I live in a town that has a private bike pickup service. So I'm able to pay a fee for the pickup of my food scraps that then they haul by bike to the municipal transfer station. Nonetheless, if curbside collection is not an option, then you can potentially start with the residential drop-off program, which is also a good opportunity to do that in tandem with educational workshops. So again, kind of addressing the potential contamination through that education that can be potentially easier if managing at drop-off sites. And here there's a link to a hauler contracting guidance document that we also refer to in the toolkit. So we, as Center for Ecotechnology, we developed this contracting guidance document that details the best practices for contracting and working with businesses, just key points to remember when making these or modifying these agreements. Likewise, the toolkit includes a reference to a compost operator guidebook that outlines the different equipment options and types of collection containers that might be able to either find or supplement your program with.
Great. So just a few wrap-up slides to capture what's in the guide. One of the areas we get into is cost and economic considerations. And as I refresh my memory with what's there, it really hit me that labor truly for many yard waste composting sites could present the most significant cost consideration, because many existing yard waste composting facilities, if they're operated seasonally or even if they're year round, they're not necessarily staffed every day. So when you decide you want to start taking in food waste, that requires somebody to be there to receive the loads, make sure the loads are not overly contaminated or contaminated at all, and then also handle the materials that we alluded to in the best practices slide. So labor could be for many facilities a big question and area to analyze. Some of the other, in terms of economic considerations, facilities are able to charge a higher tipping fee for food waste loads in some cases than they get for yard trimmings. So that just factors in. Permits may change, as Corey alluded to, so there may be some expense there. So those are just a sampling. And the other point I just want to make with the slide you're looking at is for facilities that started lower tech and just gradually started taking in different food waste loads, once they find that they're really comfortable with it and it's beneficial and they're servicing a lot of generators, may do a significant upgrade to the site. And one of the key things is a covered food waste receiving area for year-round operation, which is definitely an asset in climates where you get a number of rainy or snowy days, and then a system that has a higher degree of process control and maybe allows you to accept more material than you would be able to in a windrow facility just because of the processing method. Next, please. Compost markets, it's incredible. Every composter I talk to these days is having booming sales right now. And so I just hope that once people, all these new folks discover the benefits of using compost for their landscapes and their gardens, that this just is a continual boom every year that we'll see as a result of more people staying at home and planting gardens or landscapes. The couple of considerations with regard to a food waste compost is it may increase the nutrient content of the compost as well as the salt content. This could be not a concern, but it's something that you want to be aware of in case one of your big markets is, let's say you're doing a mix for nurseries, for potting mixes. If they're growing more sensitive plants, it could be a consideration. But for the most part, most applications, it's not a big factor. And the one thing Corey got into, and we get into in the guide, but contamination is a huge factor for end markets. So it just speaks to starting out at the very beginning, as Corey was pointing out, with good separation practices, very clear on what's accepted or not accepted, because it goes all the way down, passes all the way through to the end market. And just one example shown in this slide of a compost application is for disease suppression. And that's just a really exciting area for opportunity that has been studied, for many, many decades. Next, please. As far as final takeaways, it's really important to emphasize, and we point this out in the beginning and want to point it out right now, is that the current scale of the facility is not the determining, the determining factor when looking into composting food waste. The most significant factor is food waste is an organic waste that does not degrade gracefully. So you need to be prepared, whether you are a very low-tech facility using a front-end loader to turn piles of leaves and brush that come in seasonally, or a full-scale facility with windrow turners and all sorts of equipment, that you have to be prepared. And the final message that I think I want to impart is to start slow, learn best practices to manage food waste at your facility, and then you can gradually increase the quantity and the types of food waste recovered. But you want to be very purposeful and practical, and just make sure it fits well with your operation. And you don't want to get in trouble right out of the starting gate. Corey.
Great. Well, we'll wrap it up pretty much here in the sense that we do hope you find this toolkit of value as you potentially begin to assess if your operations are suitable for food scraps. And then the community toolkit itself is available on Wasted Food Solutions on our toolbox, just here on our homepage, and there you will be able to find other supplementary guidance documents that may help as you kind of undergo this process, as well as state-specific resources, also for New York and other states that can help the overall reduction and recovery of food scraps. And if you have not already, definitely sign up for BioCycle Connect. I know I really enjoy getting the weekly newsletter. There's a lot of great content in there. It even featured the community toolkit document, which, is a great document. So thank you all for having us speak today, and we're happy to maybe take a question if we have time. If not, again, at the end or at the compost chat.
Thanks, Corey and Nora. And so everyone in your chats, you'll see that I did include a link to BioCycle Connect if you'd like to sign up. It is a free newsletter to sign up for. And I also put a link to the community toolkit for you, everyone, to check it out. We have time for one or two questions. So one of the questions was, for composting facilities who do not do any of the hauling, they contract with other, outside haulers. What types of stakeholder engagement processes would you suggest to engage with private sector hauling companies requesting that they add organics collection services to their bill?
Corey, you good to take that with the hauling element, or would you like me to?
We can tag team. So yes, that's an interesting component. There are instances where you are working with a private hauler that may not be ready to start accepting food scraps, just based on equipment needs, labor, etc. And so we have seen towns start with that drop-off program, opt-in, drop-off. So you're starting with small, kind of getting some residents comfortable with it, as well as your own operations comfortable. And then I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are, and there's going to continue to be, the organics recycling laws and zero waste goals that can help these stakeholder engagement discussions, because it's, you might be the driver, but ultimately there's also these other factors that come into play.
And I would just quickly add that one of the important things when you're approaching haulers, as Corey mentioned, is do they have the equipment, but the training and the source separation information and how the haulers set up the program with the generators, especially on the commercial side. And then there are clauses in either the contract or wherever the contract is between the hauler and the generator, the hauler and the composting facility, that, for load rejection, and then ways to communicate back to the generator what the problem is. And one, if a hauler is starting a program, one really good way to educate both the generators they're bringing on and the haulers is have them come to the composting site, with a load, for example, and just see what's in there and how it affects the facility. That's really more once you get a few clients coming on board, but you really get to experience what happens at the site itself.
Thank you. So we're going to move on for now, and we'll try to get to more questions at the end when we do all of our general Q&A. And in the meantime, we're going to switch over and just hear a word from another one of our silver sponsors, Milton Cat, who submitted just a short video for us to watch. Waiting to pull up the video from our silver sponsor, Milton Cat, before we move into our next presentation from James.
My sincere apologies, Christine. I thought it was playing. Here we go. My sincere apologies right now. Christine, are you seeing the video come through?
It's not playing on my end, but someone did say the video was playing. We'll just keep moving, and we will send the link around for everyone to see. Another person just said the video is not playing, so we're just going to keep moving, and we will send the video around when we send around the recording and the presentations from today's webinar. So moving in next, we have James McSweeney. James is the author of Community Scale Composting Systems, a comprehensive designer and practitioner's manual for food scraps composters. He's also the founder of Compost Technical Services, which is a consulting practice that specializes in composting systems. So Savannah will switch the presenters mode over to you, James, and I will unmute you and we'll get going.
Oh, looks like I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in these unusual this unusual time. You can picture me. I'm hiding in my basement right now, hoping that my kids don't melt down upstairs, and I won't be offended in the least if some of you are out in your gardens this beautiful day. So, which is what I often do. during these webinars, and I'll go back and kind of piece through some of the slides that I wanted to see. But
Hey, James, my sincere apologies for cutting in right now. Can you go to your sharing screen and click the play button? It seems to be stuck in video right now. You are the presenter, but it seems to be stuck on that.
It's not playing. It's sorry. It's not playing, right? You can't see my screen?
No, give me one moment. I'm going to. All right, sending presenter mode back to you. My sincere apologies for this
Show my
technical
screen.
issue with that video. Perfect. You are now showing.
That's showing. Okay, awesome. All right. Yeah, so I'm bummed that we're not meeting each other in person, but hopefully some of you are joining us who may not have been able to be there in person. So this portion is going to be focused on some of, a brief intro to some of the sort of the technical aspects of composting, really just looking at composting basics. I want to make a pitch for anyone, to anyone who's seriously considering bringing food scraps into your yard trimmings facility, that your managers and operators attend a week-long technical training like the Maine Compost School or like the USCC's technical trainings. One of the main things that I hear from operators, particularly in municipal operations, is that someone was managing the facility for 20 years and then they took over and were sort of passed down a bare minimum type of information, and so once food scraps are incorporated, as Nora put it, there's a whole nother set of considerations. There's a lot higher risk and nuisance potential. So that type of sort of intensive training is so valuable. It really positions a community to mitigate the types of issues that do arise inevitably when sort of things roll out too fast. There were, and I also second what Nora said about starting slow, just kind of easing in slow, getting to know this new material. Food scraps are high moisture and high protein, nitrogen, and those two tend to lead to smells, anaerobic conditions that can, and are also obviously a food source for things. This first slide is just kind of referring to, I'm just gonna hide my little side screen here so then I can't get rid of that. Oops. There we go. I can actually see my slides a little bit better. So, when we're talking about composting, we're really talking about creating conditions. Microbes that are degrading organic materials really aren't that dissimilar from us. They need a right balance of protein, carbohydrate, other forms. They can obviously degrade much more complex forms of carbon than we can, but they need moisture, not too much, not too little, and oxygen. So we're talking about aerobic processes. And let's see here. As decomposition commences, microbes are degrading carbon, releasing carbon dioxide and heat. Moisture is lost. Generally, there's sort of a transition from as wet materials, as cell walls degrade, moisture is released. The material tends to get a little bit more dense, a little bit wetter, and then over time it dries out and moisture is lost through evaporation and we try to avoid leaching or or sort of liquids coming out of the base of the pile as much as possible. And when we're talking about the degradation of carbon and nitrogen, nitrogen is also lost to the atmosphere in various forms. And so when we're talking about raw, dead organic matter, food scraps, carbon materials, we're taking sort of a dead organic matter, which is, in the case of food materials, is typically pretty highly putrescible, has the high risk nuisance potential, and there are volatile compounds which are food sources for microbes. And so what we're trying to do is create the conditions for those volatile compounds to degrade. And in the presence of oxygen, microbes metabolize volatile compounds and they become stable and living organic matter. And that is what compost is stable living organic matter, and along with, of course, mineral content and moisture. So in the presence of oxygen, under aerobic conditions, microbes break down material fast and completely. There's a period at the beginning of the composting process where temperatures rise to temperatures above 131 degrees. And if all particles are able to reach 131 degrees for 3 days or more, 131 or greater for 3 days or more, that is considered sort of the minimum for pathogen reduction and weed seed reduction in inactivation. And that is achieved through aeration, providing oxygen through turning, and forced aeration. And in the presence of oxygen, odors are, and with proper sort of containment of the material, odors are minimized. So generally, there's some really critical components to food scrap composting facilities that aren't necessarily there in pure yard debris facilities. Obviously, you have your raw feedstocks, but Nora and Corey mentioned the importance of having a dedicated receiving and blending area. Wet material coming in, getting blended up, tends to beat up on the working surface, and the last thing you want is dug out, wet, kind of ponding where you're receiving material. So it's absolutely critical if an operation is at any scale at all, really, to have a concrete mixing bay. I don't advise going ahead without one, except for maybe on just a pilot scale. And then thinking about how that blended material is going to move into what I refer to as a primary composting phase. This is the phase where the most management is required, and where that heat treatment period is going to sort of be the target, where the most volatile compounds are breaking down and where the heat treatment is taking place. And then oftentimes it's sort of in the same area, but the process moves into a secondary phase past that heat treatment period. There's still sort of some rawness to it. It's not a finished product at all, but requires slightly less management, slightly less monitoring. And then it moves into sort of the curing, the finishing, the curing, the storage phase, where a lot less management is required. Material can kind of be consolidated slightly more. And then, of course, the post-processing distribution. So that's sort of the general flow. It's really important to kind of have a plan for how that's going to work, what the process flow of the site is going to look like, and how it is going to differ from how the facility operated before. And in terms of a timeline, it can actually be slightly faster than yard trimmings alone. When you add nitrogen in to the process, that tends to speed things up a little bit because carbon is the material that's sort of the slowest in breaking down. But generally in the Northeast, we're talking somewhere between 6 and 12 months. Often it seems to fall around 8 or 9 months to kind of a finished product, and then there's often some curing and storage that takes place after that. The phases can be longer or shorter depending on how much aeration and how much management's happening in the particular type of system that's being utilized. Sites close. Sites mainly close because of odor or odor complaints. So that's a very real consideration, obviously. I don't need to tell anybody that, I'm sure. There's also, but often it's good to point that out to composters. Yeah, it's something that it's really important to kind of just be open about and know that we can mitigate the threat. Sometimes odor complaints are NIMBYism, but oftentimes they're actually very real problems that are being created by a composting facility. So for better or for worse. There's also obviously economic factors, kind of poor planning. Facilities that grow too fast don't have the capacity to manage the volume of material that they've taken on, tend to run into odor problems, tend to run into product quality problems, vectors, that sort of thing. So planning, training, implementation of best management practices and sort of institutionalizing those practices as part of the operational plan is absolutely critical. Gonna just run through the absolute basic best management practices that every food scrap composting facility needs to be thinking about. Recipe is how the materials that are coming into the process are combined in proportion to one another. Materials that are wet that are above 60% moisture generally require dry matter to balance out. Materials that have a C to N ratio above 30 to 1 or below 25 to 1 require the opposite to balance. So and then materials like food often, they really require what's called a bulking agent. These are porous, usually woody particles that create structure, allow the material to stack vertically and allow it to breathe, create pore space and voids so that oxygen can move through the material. In general, we're talking about analytically, I highly recommend analytically developed recipes, which are recipes where the different feedstocks have been sent to a lab or where appropriate sort of book values for those materials are used, and they act as a baseline from which the operator can kind of make decisions about, because the recipe is not a static thing. It's something that the composter will get to know over time and have to adjust for. If we have time, I'm gonna pull up a recipe calculator at the end, but I wanna keep moving, make sure we touch on everything. Blending is absolutely critical. Getting the moist and high nitrogen, high protein materials into contact with the bulking agent and with the carbon leads to much faster activation, much more complete and efficient breakdown of those putrescent and volatile compounds. So recipe is absolutely critical to creating that favorable aerobic conditions that lead to thermophilic hot composting and can allow you to hit those pathogen weed seed inactivation targets. We won't get too far into this, but the operating in the balance of between 25 and 40 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio allows you to retain both carbon and nitrogen in the process, and obviously preventing odors. We think that we kind of know, I don't know, it's very hard to know just based off of reading a book what a material has in it in terms of what that C to N ratio is. I've looked at lots and lots and lots of materials and sent many of them off to labs and often been very surprised. So using an analytically based recipe is provides information that you know just visual assessment and touch and feel cannot provide. But mostly recipes are sort of this reference point, sort of, you know where you want to be, you know what proportion of different materials will, under ideal conditions, create conditions conducive to aerobic fast composting. But those feedstocks do change, so it's good to start with that reference point and then be able to adapt. I tend to think of things, I think we often think of composting materials as greens, the high nitrogen, or browns, the high carbon, but actually a lot of the materials that we deal with are sort of more in this neutral range that are kind of already in the ideal carbon and nitrogen range. So I think it's helpful to know what materials actually are really high nitrogen, what materials actually are really high carbon, and what ones are more neutral. The neutral ones you can use kind of as much or as little as you want to, because they're not going to throw the balance off that much. They're good for diluting and preventing nuisance problems by sort of diluting the high nitrogen problems or feedstocks. And the bulking agents are absolutely critical, typically having at least 10% of a sort of a large particle around an inch is ideal, of a bulking agent blended into the mix, adds that aeration and adds that structure. So temperature, obviously, you know, being able to monitor and to hit temperature treatment, what we're really looking at is being able to monitor batches and turn the piles or aerate the piles to meet the temperature treatment standards. And here's an example of a monitoring sheet where, you know, in this case, there were 4 different points along the pile where the temperature was being monitored at 1 and 3 feet, and where the goal was to turn the pile 5 times and maintain 131 degrees or greater for at least 3 days in between those turnings. The pathogen reduction happens, we tend to focus on thermal destruction because that's something we can see when we stick a probe in the pile, take the temperature, something we can monitor. In truth, there's a lot more happening. There is ammonia is acting as kind of a disinfectant. There is a lot of competition happening between the beneficial microorganisms and pathogens. There's antagonism. There's antibiotics being produced by fungi and actinomycetes. And then there's sort of this natural die-off that's happening because the composting environment, particularly as it progresses, is just not conducive to gut pathogens and most of the pathogens that we see. So we're really, it's important to be hitting the heat treatment targets, and it's also good to know that time is an ally in terms of pathogen reduction. Not true with weed seeds. We really need the thermal destruction in terms of weed seeds. The hotter the temperature, the faster the destruction of pathogens. It's called the time-temperature relationship. So you can see sort of the decline here in Salmonella enteritis at 54C versus 50C. It happens a lot faster. So again, what we refer to often as the process to further reduce pathogens is the EPA standard, very similar to the National Organic Program standard. It's at least 5 turnings for turned windrows while maintaining 131 degrees or greater for at least 15 days. PFRP for aerated static pile and in vessel is a minimum of 3 days above 131 degrees or greater. So institutionalizing BMPs, tracking each batch in terms of that monitoring and management, taking sort of having consistent monitoring protocols at 1 and 3 feet at multiple points is the standard that I teach. Having a maturity standard, so knowing when the compost is mature. So, say it's, you're not going to get sell compost if it's above 90 degrees or 100 degrees. There's different standards that different folks have. Preventing the reintroduction of pathogens, so keeping finished compost out of the stream of any liquids that would be coming off of fresh compost or heat-treated compost. Maintaining aerobic conditions. One of the best ways to do this is to keep the piles small early in the process. This is especially true at yard debris facilities where the norm is 10 feet or greater piles. That doesn't work very well with food because the air just can't get into the center, and so that's creating stagnant conditions where there's an anaerobic core and where there's the material is just getting putrescent in there. So it actually slows down the process to have it piled that high. I tend to say 7 feet or under, at least in that initial stage, will definitely degrade things a lot faster. Periodic testing for pathogens is also highly recommended.
Hi, James. This is Christine.
Yeah.
We've only got about a couple more minutes before we're going to move into Q&A, just so you know. Okay.
All right. Well, so moisture, here's another big thing. Here's an example. This is actually a yard waste composting facility that was managing food, and this is really what we're trying to avoid in these facilities is what's happening on this pad right here is that there's low spot, there's pooling, there's organic matter that's obstructing the flow of water off of the pad. And so moisture management and kind of having a facility that is prepared to manage, not only the moisture that's coming out of the air, but all the moisture that's coming out of the atmosphere, but all the moisture that you're bringing in when you're bringing in tons and tons of food that may be 80% moisture. It's an enormous amount of water to be dealing with. So it's important to have improved pad surfaces, have them graded, keep them level so to avoid pooling and avoid clean water upslope, keep the pad clear from debris and organic matter. Vectors are another big one. I know Nora, she had that beautiful picture of that facility with the big superstructure, which I assume was the receiving bay of that facility. That having a place to receive material and keep, basically prevent birds, which are a big problem at food scrap facilities. To mitigate that, having materials covered instantly and basically keeping any food sources for vectors covered is absolutely critical. Aesthetics matter. There's certainly a difference when you see a facility where there's a focus and an awareness of instituting best management practices. People smell with their eyes. They tend to associate trash visually, disorganization with mismanagement and issues. So it's absolutely critical to just, here's an example of a beautiful facility that you can see that there was a lot of pride taken in how the site was set up and managed. I know that I'm out of time, unfortunately, so hopefully we can cover some of the ground that hopefully we covered most of sort of the basic best management practices stuff here. Christine, do we need to wrap this up or should I keep going?
Yeah, let's wrap it up. We have some questions that came in.
Great. Which
I think will speak to some of the other stuff you were getting at. So I guess one of them is, so yeah, you had mentioned, the birds coming onto site, and that's a problem that some sites that transfer from taking yard waste to accepting food scraps. If you could just talk to more about how to control birds and other pests that might come onto the site.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the most important thing is to prevent habituation, because once they know that there's lunch, seagulls, crows, they will, they'll set their clocks to it, to that truck coming onto the site. So, so having someone there to receive and covering material immediately with carbon materials, if at all possible, if the space can be covered, that's a good deterrent. But most of the facilities that I work with don't have a structure, and they're able to avoid kind of getting that habituation started by just covering the material quickly. And also capping. I didn't talk about capping. Capping is an incredibly useful tool, and all it is covering up freshly blended food or compost piles with a thick layer, like 6 to 12 inches of a carbon material, like a leaf and yard waste or grindings or compost, semi-mature compost.
Great. And as we go forward, Nora and Corey, feel free to jump in on any of these questions. Let me just, you may just make sure you unmute yourself when you join in. Another question we had was, as you start taking food scraps, that's going to include fruit and vegetable seeds. And are those seeds cooked out, or are there certain types of fruit and vegetables that will persist through the composting?
They definitely get cooked out if you're hitting temperatures, and if that material is in the hot portion of the pile, they get cooked out.
Okay. Let's see what else we had here. Do you have a guess as to, you had mentioned when you go from yard waste to food scraps composting, It does require some more site management as far as turning piles. Do you have a guess at, percent cost increase from those type of operational changes?
I'd put that one back to Corey and Nora if you have a sense. I don't know.
So the question, Christine, is what the incremental cost increase is if you're starting to take in food waste. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. And if by turning more, basically if there's any sort of percentage increase that you guys have heard of.
Yeah, it's interesting. We just finished a series by Craig Coker on compost business management. And I know there's some calculations, or not calculations, but discussion in there. Just off the, quickly to explain, if you're taking, like we discussed, the different types of food waste, and let's just say you're going with pre-consumer vegetative, and you already have, a lot of ground yard trimmings, and you're taking in, as James pointed out, where you have a nice mix, so you have structure as to the pile. So essentially, you're just receiving the load, mixing that in right away, putting it down on a bed of mulch or ground yard trimmings, and getting it into the pile and covering. We always recommend covering it with a cap of something initially, whether it's finished compost or more ground yard trimmings. So that increase is a matter of, it could be, as depending on the quantity you're taking, it's that much more with the operator handling the load. And then there will be also an increase in monitoring the piles, just to make sure they're not going aerobic, you're hitting the temperatures for pathogen. So incrementally, if you can do it with the current staff and with a bucket loader, for example, it's really a matter, I think, of time, if you have the bulking agent you need and whatnot. James, I'd be curious. It's a great question. But I can't be more specific because I'd be misleading you. That's
I know that one of the yard debris composters I worked with here in Massachusetts, who incorporated food and was, in the 20 ton per week range, I believe, was doing so as sort of an economic decision. I think that the budget of the site was actually better with the food. And I think that he could have and probably should have invested more in the infrastructure and hadn't quite gotten there yet. But without all that extra work, which he needed to do anyway, frankly, the math worked out better because of the tipping fee, and because he was able to create a higher quality product, and he had a market for it.
Great. And the last question I'll just say is, with the New York State food donation and food scraps recycling law coming up, this is really a time for yard waste composters to think about if they want to expand their operations into accepting food scraps. What would be your top 1 or 2 quick pieces of advice for anyone who's looking to get started?
I'd say be prepared. In that, I mean, you really do need to have that carbon source available, and I think James could go into the best management practice detail. But if all you have really are leaves, and depending on the moisture amount and whatnot, you really need to be prepared and have the right recipe. Always, we recommend, if you can, to take in a test load or 2 to just get a feeling for what you're doing before you scale up. So that gets to the starting slowly. And really, you've got to be more vigilant in terms of your compost process. So if you don't have somebody at that site on a regular basis, because all you were taking in was fall and spring, you know, leaves and yard trimmings and garden trimmings and going to the site a couple of days to a week, that changes when you start taking in food waste. So it's not just, oh, I have bulking agent because I compost yard trimmings, but it's a process starting, as James I think really was starting to get into with the recipes and whatnot.
Great, thanks, Nora. So we are going to have to end the webinar here. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. I apologize we didn't get to them all. And I also want to thank our sponsors, We Care Denali, Milton Cat, and Casella Organics for sponsoring the webinar. So as I mentioned earlier, we will be continuing the conversation in a compost chat. The Zoom link has been sent in the chat. We'll start at 3:20 just to give people time to switch over to that. And then it'll be a time to turn on your videos, meet people face to face, and have some more in-depth conversation. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining, and hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar.
Hey, Christine, I'm going to hop off. And if you want to, when you exit out, you can end it for everybody.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.